Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin J. Elliott. Kevin is a political scientist and lecturer in ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. His main research interests are in political theory, particularly democratic theory. He's especially interested in the ethics of democratic citizenship and the design of political institutions, especially democratic political institutions. Much of his research investigates questions at the intersection of normative and empirical inquiry, and so draws from both. His work has appeared in a host of journals, including, the list is much longer than what I'm about to tell you, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics and Political Theory. He received his PhD from Columbia University and a master's in political theory from the London School of Economics. His research has been supported by the US Department of Education, Princeton University's University Center for Human Values, Columbia's Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, and the Institute for Humane Studies. So Kevin's current book project, not what we're talking about today, but what he's working on now, draws on a variety of resources, including the history of political thought, to examine the issue of term length in democratic institutions, and more generally, the question of how long office holders in a democracy should hold on to power. And Kevin is, of course, also the author of the book that we're discussing today, Democracy for Busy People, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. As busy as all of us are, this book is well worth your time. People are just going to keep saying stuff like that. I highly recommend it to you. I read it together with the students in my Introduction to Political Theory class for graduate students last semester, and it was one of the most engaging and lively discussions we all had. We had all semester, and I'm therefore all the more excited to welcome Kevin to UVA and to hear more about how we can make democracy more inclusive of busy people. Okay, Kevin, let's talk about your mother. So this book is dedicated to your mother, who you also discuss intermittently through the book itself. And you write that your mom and people like her are your main impetus for writing Democracy for Busy People. So as a way to kind of get us into the book's core questions, can you tell us about your mom and more generally about the kind of people you mean to reference with the term busy people?
Thanks, yeah. Thanks so much. My mother she's still alive. When I was a kid, she was a single working parent. She did not have a lot of time for things that weren't taking care of the child, going to work, coming home, maintaining the household. Anything that needed to be done in the household was something she had to do herself. She didn't have any help with that. She was also didn't have a college degree. And so, politics didn't really make it onto the list of priorities, shall we say. And this really ended up being something that later in life she would take a different view of. But as I went to grad school and started reading around in political science and the history of political thought to some extent, I found something curious. In the early studies of American politics, these are books like The American Voter, sort of the mid-20th century seminal works of political science. What you had were political scientists were looking at voters, looking at American society, and they were like, first of all, just what do we find? And what they find, broadly speaking, is a wide variety of citizens, some of whom are very intensely interested in politics, some of whom are very ideological. You say conservative, you say liberal, they know exactly what you mean by that. And then you find people at a lower level of intensity of interest, people who maybe don't vote very often, don't know the difference between the major parties, don't know the difference between liberal and conservative. And what these political scientists in the middle of the 20th century tried to do, among other things, is they tried to figure out how can we have a democracy that includes all of these people? Now, due to the way that political science has developed as a discipline, the differentiation of the different subfields, especially American politics, has become much more quantitative in a variety of ways. This wrestling with the plurality of different kinds of citizens has sort of fallen out of their inquiry. And in democratic theory, people are interested in making democracy more inclusive, egalitarian, and so forth, also have tended to adopt a more uniform conception of what a good citizen is. It's just, this is what it is, and we're just going to superimpose that on society as a whole. And so for me, the person I did not see represented reading democratic theory, reading political science, was people like my mother. So is there a place for people like my mother in democracy? If so, where is it? And I didn't see it. in the books that were currently written. And so I tried to write one, which ultimately would not only find a place for her, but hopefully would also find a way to protect her interests, have her represented, have her voice receive the kind of equal consideration that it deserves in our theory of democracy. We think everybody should matter equally. What do you do about people who are just not in a position to do that themselves?
Perfect, thanks. So the book is centrally about busyness, and it's also about apathy. These are kind of two central concepts in the book. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what you mean by these terms and how you understand the relationship between them. For example, I could imagine someone that was busy but not apathetic, like they care a lot about politics, but they just don't have time to participate. And I can also imagine somebody who's apathetic but not busy. They have tons of time, but they just don't care about politics, maybe because they find it irrelevant. And then I can also imagine someone who's busy and apathetic, either because their busyness made them apathetic or because their apathy about politics led them to fill their life with other activities. So how do you understand busyness and apathy and the relationship between them?
Yeah. So in sort of setting out to try to find a place for busy people, the plan that I laid out was, firstly, we need to rethink our conceptions of what a citizen is. What is a good citizen? What kinds of ideas do we need in order to make sense of a citizen who's very, very, very different? Someone like my mother, right? Somebody who's not really paying very much attention. How do we make sense of this person's status as a democratic citizen? And that required rethinking our ideals about citizenship, about democratic citizenship. And so one of the, a very common mode of citizenship, as we saw with these political scientists, is people who just are completely apathetic in the specific sense, not so much of caring, but that they simply don't devote any of their attention to politics. Takes up none of their time, takes up none of their mental space, takes up no space in their minds, I suppose. And so that's what I mean by apathy. And so the first question I thought is like, is it okay for people to be apathetic? Is it okay for someone to ignore politics? Because this would be the least demanding mode of democratic citizenship. Could it be fine if people just ignore politics, right? Because there are lots of reasons that someone might choose to seemingly just take it off the agenda altogether. And there's a robust tradition of thinking, I don't know, maybe not robust, it's more occasional. I tried to gather them together in a portion of the book of people thinking about, like, what should we make of citizens in this mode? Citizens who either don't pay attention or pay very little attention to politics. And for the most part, what I found is people who, will give an account of how it's good, it's functional, for there to be some citizens who are not very, very attached, for whom apathy should be fine. And then I take a close look at that. I think that it's very, very difficult, to the point of I don't actually think you can entirely ignore politics. There might be forms of what we would, I think, just conventionally think of as apathy that could be okay. If you pay attention a little bit sometimes, maybe you don't vote very frequently. And so you might sort of count, depending on the way that you survey, or depending on what you intuitively think of as apathy. That person, you might think that person's politically apathetic, but that wouldn't be apathy as I understand it. There might be ways. Another way is somebody who has been very involved in politics for a while, takes kind of like a season, right? A couple of years where they're just like, look, I got burnt out, maybe defeated in a local effort to make a change in their community, and then they just kind of step back. That might be fine as long as they eventually kind of like come back, and during that period of time, pay a little bit of attention to what's going on.
All right, so that leads directly to my next question. So one of the main arguments of the book is that because people are busy, we shouldn't expect too much of them when it comes to political participation. And your term for this sort of minimum floor, you're alluding to this, but your term for the minimum floor that holders of the office of democratic citizen must achieve is what you call standby citizenship. So what is standby citizenship, and why do you think it's the minimum that we should expect from our fellow citizens?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So in trying to explore how we should rethink our ideals of democratic citizenship, I looked for like a ceiling and I looked for a floor. So the floor has to be higher than apathy, and the ceiling, I'm happy to talk about that, but it's a slightly different set of considerations there. And so standby citizenship is where I end up. So the idea of standby citizenship, as the kind of term implies, it has two main components. The first is that you pay attention to politics, at least to some extent. And this here I reference this concept, which is another one of these discoveries of these early works of political science, and then just falls out of inquiry until 2018. It's the first time there's a book about the phenomenon of political interest, of just people who are interested in politics. Political scientists will find that this is like the most powerful determinant of whether people take part in politics. All sorts of political behaviors are ultimately very, very powerfully influenced by this. And political scientists have not really looked at it. They have it in their models, then they don't. So, political interest, number one. But that's not enough, right? Because what you will sometimes find is if somebody is paying attention to politics and then they go, boy, I'm like really animated about something, what do I do? And if they don't have any skills, if they don't have any of the embodied knowledge of how to go about even voting, they're going to not be in a position to actually step in. So a standby citizen is somebody who will be prepared to step into political action should they see that their participation is called for. So the other element is that you have the civic skills, which include, above all, like the knowledge, the practical knowledge of how to go about participating in politics. You need at least these two things. So attention, ideally a kind of critical attention to politics, plus the ability to step in. And it seems to me like one of the things I want to emphasize about the utility of this concept is not that this is an ideal of citizenship, right? It is a minimum. And I think that this is a useful concept for telling the difference between three groups. So our citizens who are doing the minimum, right? That's an important category because it's different from people who are not doing the minimum. It helps us to tell the difference between somebody who is at least putting in the amount of effort that they need, that democracy needs from them. But then there's another group that it also tells the difference between, and that's citizens who are doing the minimum and citizens who are doing very well, citizens who are virtuous, the excellent citizen, right? And that is a category we should be able to tell the difference between, and we should not necessarily be always wagging our fingers at somebody who's doing the minimum or maybe a little bit more than the minimum for falling short of excellence. We're all going to fall short of excellence in a variety of ways, right? And this allows us to tell the difference between these categories. I think that's useful. I think that's something that helps us to find a place for people who are not able to fulfill a more demanding standard. One of the big takeaways from the book, I just want to mention this because it's worth reiterating. If you want democracy to be equal, you have to make it undemanding. And this is part of the way that we do that, is with a minimum that allows us to make sense of what it would mean to have a truly equal, inclusive democracy.
Terrific. That last formulation is very helpful. Okay, so let me ask you another question about standby citizenship, both because it's an important part of the book and because I'm curious. So standby citizenship, it's the minimum that citizens are supposed to do. And I take it standby citizenship is okay under one of two circumstances. One is, and maybe you'll disagree with this, but one is, okay, things are going well. I look out into the world, things are not terrible. I can just stand by, but I'm ready to pounce in if the situation calls for it. And the other time when standby citizenship is okay is, okay, there's a lot of people who are just like me. They're out there, they're doing our thing. We don't need another one of me out there.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's take somebody who's really concerned, for example, about climate change or racial injustice. And they look around and they say, things are not good. There aren't enough people who believe the things that I believe who are out there fighting. Those people have an obligation, this is my question, to do more than be standby citizens. And so I'm wondering, for people who sort of care about these sort of like very pressing, very intransigent, very important issues, standby citizenship seems like it's sort of off the table for them and that their duties are somewhat higher. Can you just sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the language of duty and obligation is, I think that's where, if there's a disagreement, I don't know if you mean this in a strong sense, but yeah, if you find issues in a way, like that's the working out of this model well, right? They are recognizing that their voice is needed, that these issues are not being well treated. And I like the way that another thing that's important here is thinking about the different modes of participation. So you mentioned that if there's not enough people who are thinking about this issue, not enough, how did you put it? Not enough people are Well, you said something along the lines like not enough people are concerned about this issue or thinking about this issue, or don't have maybe
Acting.
and like they don't have the right like beliefs about it, something like that. That calls for a different kind of participation, right? That might be like you need to talk to people about it. You need to share the fact that you have a certain kind of view, which maybe people in this room aren't shy about sharing their beliefs in public forum, like social media and things like that, right? But like that might be the kind of thing that's like required to help raise this issue as something that people like me are worried about, which very importantly, one of the things that I'm concerned about is the way that both apathy and engagement is social, meaning that it flows through social networks. So one of the problems with true political apathy is that people who are like you, people who are in your social circles, if you are like if you articulate anti-political stuff, like politics is terrible, it's all corrupt, it's not for people, it's not good, I'm not going to do any of it, then other people in your social group, people who are like you, will recognize that as like, oh, that's like a view that I could have. And that if enough people inside the group, right, come to have that view, it becomes a norm. And then other people are then trying to decide, should I be a part of this? Should I take concern with this issue? Right? They can then ignore it if it's not being talked about by people in their social group and become apathetic in that case. So anyway, when it comes to citizens, right, stepping in, if they recognize the things that they are concerned with, they ought to do that. Is that a duty of theirs? Maybe. I think there's a way of making sense of standby citizenship as when you judge something pressing that you ought to, you have an obligation to, it's your duty to step in. I think that makes sense. Maybe I would put it that way. Yeah, and then to the extent that you are then laying the claim before others, you should also be concerned about this. You should also be, that's in a way to explain the social dimension of how political activism works, how social movements can get knitted together, and again, how they can propagate. But ultimately, right, it's going to be very hard to take somebody, this is one of the points, is that somebody who isn't even a standby citizen, well, then you've got to be like, why should I care about this issue? I don't even know what this means. What do you mean we can like do something about this, right? I went downtown and there was a statue downtown that's like not there anymore, right? And for a long time, if you're walking past that statue, you've been like, that's like a fixed part of this community and it has a certain meaning and then when it's gone, right? That is something that a group of people made happen, right? That opens your imagination about what politics can do. But if you're a standby citizen, if you're not a standby citizen, you're like, oh, that thing was there and now it's gone. Well, whatever. You don't understand that something has happened, something political has happened. So failing to be a standby citizen makes political happenings illegible to you. You don't even know what's happening. So yeah, that is, you should try to help your fellow citizens make legible, here's a problem. I would agree, I think.
Okay.
And I think standby citizenship helps us to make sense of both the transition into activism and also one of the things that you're doing as an activist. You're trying to kind of get other people to step in as well. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So in the book, you talk a lot about what you call the paradox of empowerment. And so this is basically the idea, and you also alluded to this before, that new democratic innovations that are meant to sort of provide more inclusion often get sort of taken over by relatively privileged people. For example, even when a random selection of people are invited to a deliberative assembly, the participants tend to be disproportionately privileged. And this leads you to argue that we should exercise caution about introducing new democratic institutions because those institutions will likely be captured by privileged subgroups. And this is especially the case if those institutions require a lot of time to participate in. So I would love to hear more about the paradox of empowerment. And I thought maybe particularly as it relates to protest. So as you know, the sort of street protests, right? Protests are not immune from the paradox of empowerment. As we saw, the 2017 Women's March was criticized of sort of catering mostly to the interests of middle-class white women. But when we think about other protests, such as the protests in the summer of 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd or the Arab Spring, many people went out to protest despite the cost and the inconveniences and the dangers. And I'm wondering if you think that protest is less prone to the paradox of empowerment than more institutionalized forms of political participation. And more generally, is there anything that you could say kind of as a general matter about what kinds of institutions are, what forms of political participation are more prone to this paradox than others? So I get that sort of like the deliberative ones that take a lot of time are going to be more prone to it. But as we're looking across all these different sorts of like innovative, like democratic practices and institutions, what should we kind of have our antenna up for when we're worrying about the paradox of empowerment?
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, thank you. So the paradox of empowerment is this. It's a phenomenon. We observe it in lots of contexts. What happens is when you have a space that's meant to empower of the people, that stage becomes at the same time a place, insofar as it's an empowered space. People who are in society and have the resources to access that space, the people who can access it most easily, are going to be relatively advantaged there. So one example of this in the 1990s, this sort of international aid universe became very enamored of the concept of participation because there was this line of critique that aid programs were a bit like, well-to-do, white people dropping aid that they have determined what it will be for into their communities. And so what they said is, okay, what we want to do is we're going to have these forums where local people can decide where these aid dollars are how they're distributed, basically, how they're used. The thing is that what we saw in a lot of these forums is people within the local community who are relatively advantaged, men, people of higher caste, older people, wealthier people, would capture these and would use them to reinforce their already existing advantages. That's the paradox of empowerment. The other kind of most characteristic example of this is campaign finance, right? If you do, and I don't necessarily have this view, but certainly the view of the Supreme Court of this country, that like money is a way of participating in politics, right? Giving money is a way to participate in politics. If you think of it that way, then getting rid of campaign finance, that is to say, not allowing people to give lots of money into politics, would be a reduction of democracy, right? You're reducing the ways that people can participate. The paradox of empowerment is that by reducing some forms of participation that are especially prone to people who are relatively advantaged in society, using them to gain more power for themselves, you can actually enhance democratic equality. So the context of, what was the
protests. Yeah,
yes,
like
exactly.
the
Good.
George Floyd protests.
So when should we be most worried about the paradox of empowerment? One, when participation is very demanding. The quintessential example I give of this are like local meetings, like for your local school board or maybe your local government. If that's in the evening, I have two kids. I'm not going to go to a thing at 6. Like I have to be putting my kids to bed. We're getting dinner on the table. Like this is not a good time for me. So who's going to come? People who either don't have children, people who are who kids are out of the house, and that just is a reliable way of patterning who's going to be empowered by that type of democratic institution, right? So protest. Is it? I think it can be amenable. Again, you have to think of the cost. What are the costs of protest, and who is in the best position to shoulder those costs? A very sort of obvious one would be people who are disabled, for instance, right? There's a very famous protest, speaking of protest, of back in the 90s before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. Maybe some of you recall this, but some disabled activists were pulling themselves up the steps of the Capitol. It's like, right, an extraordinary act of protest, right? Costly, difficult, but it actually, that's just an example. We think about the costs of protest. Sometimes those costs can be low and sometimes they can be high. The way that police will respond to protest can raise the costs. If you think you're going to get your head busted by the cops, you're going to stay out of the street. When I was in college, I went to UCLA. Our basketball team went to the national championship one day, and the LAPD deployed literally a cavalry regiment of police going down the middle of the street. And it was like made very clear what would happen if because the last time they won the national championship, there was a riot. Okay, I understand. Nonetheless, that's a way of visibly increasing the cost of protest as a form of participation. The other thing, though, about protest, there are costs, but there's also like rewards that if insofar as a protest becomes like a festival, which sometimes it can be fun. I participated in some of the protests in New York City in 2017. They were kind of fun. Like there were elements of it that were fun. And that's a way, so insofar as a protest is like open and fun and the cops aren't going to beat people up, that could be less likely to be prone to the paradox of empowerment. When it's a more militant type of situation, if it's in the winter, it's another thing, is that like the timing of these things sometimes matters. Yeah, but I think you have to look at the particulars of it. Protest could be, historically has tended to favor younger people, right? But yeah, think about the costs, think of the demandingness of it. Yeah.
Terrific. Okay. So an important argument in the first half of the book is that it can sometimes be better on democratic grounds to reduce access to very time-intensive forms of political participation because some people are too busy to participate in them, right? So if we take away this top tier of like super demanding stuff, then the stuff that's going to be available is going to be more accessible to more people, then it's more inclusive. But I'm wondering if there's sort of an unspoken assumption at work in all of this that people are only going to ever act in their own self-interest. So I'm imagining there have been times when I, as a busy person, you know, I can't go to the PTO meeting, but I tune in on Zoom and I see there are other people there. I'm like, oh, thank you, people, for going and doing this thing, right? And so there are times, like if we sort of imported ideas of sort of like coalition or solidarity into this model, might there be ways in which like I, as a busy person, could want other people who are kind of like me in the relevant ways, but maybe less busy to go and participate? And do you want to talk about sort of the advantages to thinking in that way and maybe some of the drawbacks?
Yeah. So one of the ways that you can try to manage this, and the way that this would be translated in some democratic theory, contemporary democratic theory, would be the way of thinking of other citizens as unelected representatives. So think of maybe an activist who will say, in an empowered space, they will enter the space and say, I'm here speaking for, right, these other people, right? I'm a single working mother. I have somehow managed to like make myself available here. I'm here to speak for, you know, single working mothers. Theorists have been puzzling over this because it's a very different kind of representation than we tend to think about, right? What an election is, among other things, or at least in some cases, are different candidates saying, I want to speak for you. So then voting for them is a way of authorizing them to speak for you, right? That's one of the ways of understanding what happens in that case. When you don't have somebody who has that kind of an authorization relationship, it raises questions about the legitimacy of their standing as a representative. Now, if that person is embedded in a project of solidarity building, if they are a part of a robust social movement, that is a way of attempting to fill that gap, that question of like, if you don't have an authorization relationship between a representative or a purported representative, someone who's making what I think Michael Sayward calls the representative claim. I'm going to represent you. That's a claim, right, that they're making. And citizens need to have a way to either say yes to that or to say no to that. To the extent that you don't have some kind of connection, some kind of way to either accept that claim, reject that claim, I'm going to be skeptical about it. I'm going to be worried that that's going to be a way for, again, relatively privileged, relatively advantaged people to leverage, in this case, elements of their own disadvantage, right? If you're a single working mother, but you're a millionaire or something, right? And it's like, I have nannies to do all of the stuff or whatever, right? It's like, okay, you're a single working mother, but like not the way that a lot of other people are. And so now you're going to come up and speak about, you know, like capital gains taxes are too high or something. And it's like, I don't think a lot of single working mothers are worried about that, but like, you know, you're the representative, right? So yeah, so that's how I would want to think about it. So there is definitely to the extent that you have successful projects of solidarity building that are transparent and that are, well, we had a protest that brought out 10,000 people in our town of 20,000, right? And I helped organize it. It's like, okay, well, then you probably are actually, you have some kind of claim that we should respect as speaking for those people. But election is still going to bring out a larger generally group of people. And so I'm going to tend to defer to people who have that more direct authorization. There are other ways of doing it. Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay. So Kevin, in the first part of this, might I say, exceptionally well-organized book, you talk about the problem of busyness, how we should understand apathy, the concept of standby citizenship, the paradox of empowerment, among other topics. And all of this leads up to a set of principles, right? Principles of institutional design for a democracy for busy people. And in the second half of the book, you explore some institutions that you think kind of are going to enact these principles that you developed particularly well. So what you say here is really interesting, and for some people it might be counterintuitive. So we're going to talk for the rest of the time, I think, about these institutional design proposals, right? So let's start with elections. So you have more faith in elections than a lot of other people. You call them the most inclusive democratic institution, but you propose some changes to make them more conducive to standby citizenship, including making voting mandatory. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why you like elections and how they could be made even better.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if this ended up in the version that's there, but in earlier ways of that line, I talk about elections as the most inclusive institution by like a comical margin. They're like comically more inclusive than anything else. And they also are they're authoritative, right? So if you show up to your local council meeting, like you can like have your say, but ultimately doesn't necessarily matter, right? The elected representatives are going to do what they're going to do. Elections are not, for the most part, merely advisory when things are working well. So that's a way of, one of the principles of institutional design that I emphasize that you want to concentrate power in institutions that in which participation is the most accessible, is the cheapest and easiest. So the first principle is make political participation cheap, easy, and undemanding. Simple, easy, and undemanding. In particular, one of the dimensions that I want to emphasize, that I do emphasize, is you want to make politics understandable, cognitively tractable. It can be very difficult, depending on the complexity of your political system, to understand as a voter, like, who do I vote out for this thing I don't like? Where do I direct my ire? And that is a very serious problem for democratic inclusion. Because if you're very mad about something, that's great, right? Then you're prepared to step in, but your civic skills are going to be you're going to have a very demanding bar of figuring out where, like I said, where to direct your ire. So the other thing, so we want to make participation easy, simple, undemanding, and then we also want to concentrate power in those institutions where power is most accessible. And to me, that's elections. But like you said, many people look at elections like, these are very broken. These are not good. So maybe we should do something else. Some people have taken the next step to say. I would say let's try to work on them. They are not good. Yes, there are ways of making them better. So the sort of small ball things that many other democracies have that ours does not for the most part, would be, for one, think very technical things you don't really think about as much, which have to do with election administration. Same-day voter registration. I think, did you guys recently have this in Virginia? Yeah, it's like kind of new, yes? Yeah, right, yes. So this is a fantastic institution for simplifying participation for citizens. It reduces by half, right, the complexity of a voting decision, because you have to figure out both, well, when do I need to register? That's a different date, which is different in every state, by the way, right? And might also, maybe it's set by the state government. Anyway, it varies. States will sometimes change it, as they did in 2021. Several states made that window, I think, short. Well, anyway, they manipulated it to try to, they manipulated it. Automatic voter registration, you can compare those, but I think same-day voter registration takes care of a lot of the problems with voter registration shenanigans. Purges of voter rolls are taken off the table by that. Automatic voter registration is helpful, but do it at the polls. Other things, having a professional civil service authority administer elections instead of having partisans who are elected to like do election administration. This is just like a recipe for making things more difficult, for ways of making things more. In this country, we have gerrymandering, right? The partisan drawing of district lines, which is huge. I mean, it is. We sort of talk about it, and maybe people appreciate it's like a bad thing, but the multiple levels of terribleness that it introduces, because it sends the message to voters that your vote doesn't matter, right? And on top of that, then it sends the message to elected officials that what voters want doesn't matter. Then on top of that, because the representatives know that the voters don't matter, well, who does matter, right? Well, somebody else, maybe people with the money in many contexts, right? People who are in a position to fund elections. So gerrymandering just like it has these like reverberating effects through the political system that, with the things that I'm concerned about, encourage citizens to say, well, voting's not a thing that is like good for me. It's not a thing that can make a difference, right? For most Americans in most places where you live, doesn't actually matter how you vote for federal office. It can matter in other places. I'm very cognizant of being in Virginia a couple of years ago. As I understand, control of the lower house literally came down to one vote in one delegate race, if I'm not mistaken. So those of you who are learning about the paradox of voting, just be like, Professor, this is all wrong. This is just incorrect. Because if I'm not mistaken, also that was one of the things that changed like healthcare. Voting matters, but gerrymandering can make people not think about that. So writ large, though, to take a step back, the reason that elections are so valuable for busy people and for an inclusive democracy that you probably are aware of, but just haven't brought to the fore. One, they are a huge coordinated social event. They pervade the social information environment. Again, also depending on where you live. I've lived in uncompetitive states my whole life. California in presidential elections, California, New York, and Kentucky, and now Connecticut, which are not competitive states, right? Haven't been for a long time. I went during election season one year to North Carolina, and I was like, whoa, turned on the television, everything, like, I was like, it was like a whole other world. Wouldn't it be great if there was competitiveness all over the place? So some of the reforms that I will talk, that I'm interested in are ways of making elections competitive everywhere. That might be a mixed blessing. You might, maybe we'll sing in a different tune if we all lived in a state that was highly competitive. But in any case, it is a different information environment, and it's one that can remind you when you're a marginal voter, when you're kind of on the edge of, should I be paying attention to this, right? Reminders will pervade and will make it something that that you become aware of, and that can elicit your participation. It also becomes something that people that in your social environment, people in your social circles will talk about, which will likewise trigger you to, oh yeah, people like me care about this. People like me are engaged with this. I should be thinking about this and should participate. A lot of other forms of participation don't have that social coordinating function. It's just very difficult to, like, as anyone who's tried to get a bunch of people in a room. Oh, look at how many people are here. This is wonderful. But like, I would not have been surprised if there were many fewer people here, because trying to get people physically together in the same place is very tough. It's very difficult. So anyway, yeah, elections get us all together at the same time, and that's nice. And we can do an even better job of that with something like mandatory voting. Happy to talk about that in Q&A if anyone is interested. But it's definitely a way to like create a universal electorate, and it would really. There's some evidence to think it would make a big difference. But, yeah.
So I think I'm asking one more question. So you can shoehorn anything else you want to say in your answer to this question.
I will.
Okay. So stepping back, I'm thinking like clearly the problem of being too busy, people being too busy to participate in politics, big problem. But I'm also thinking about the pandemic and how when people had so much time on their hands, they got very interested in politics, sometimes to not great effect, right? So going down rabbit holes of social media, et cetera, conspiracy theories. Is there a worry All right. Should we be more worried about people being too busy to participate in politics or people having too much time in their hands to participate in politics?
So I take part of the question to be also about like, can people be too
Interested
interested in politics?
Yes.
I mean,
A little tongue in cheek, but
absolutely.
situate your interest in this broader terrain.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say about the general concern about people sort of falling into rabbit holes is to understand a couple of things. So one is to take the kind of long view, to take a kind of a developmental view. So to come back to my mother. As I said, she for much of her life, she was not interested in politics, but eventually she did become interested in politics. It was because I went to college, right? Neither of my parents went to college. I got to college and I was like, Mom, like, I am learning things. This is so interesting. Like, I was talking to her on the phone and she was like, oh, that is interesting. And so in a series of conversations, I gave her some of the context of understanding what's happening in the world, basically in the political world. And that began a process of socialization for her. So she became politically socialized over many years, right? And this was a process in which she became disillusioned. She became involved in a local political party, and then she realized that this particular party in the city that she lived in was very much like an old-fashioned machine. It's like living in the Northeast. It's like an old political machine. And she's like, oh, this is like not nice. This is not great. She's still an attentive citizen, still an engaged citizen, but the way that she engaged changed because of that experience. So one of the things I would say is that insofar as somebody is coming from no interest in politics at all into falling into an anti-COVID rabbit hole, insofar as they're thinking about politics, like they've taken the first step out of the kind of apathy, ignoring politics, into seeing it as something that concerns them. And then you've got to take the long view. You've got to take well, they're just getting into this. When this was happening with my mother, George Bush was president, and there were a variety of things going on. George W. Bush, second was too. And there were a bunch of things going on there that really lit her on fire, right? Like really triggered an intense form of political interest. And is that might be good. That's a way of deepening the passion and keeping you on that political socialization trajectory. And that can fade, that can change over time. I'm not saying it will, but it can. And taking that view is good and important. I don't have solutions to the misinformation phenomenon. It's a problem, absolutely. But I think one of the things to bear in mind, people used to say about conservatives that conservatives were liberals who've been mugged by reality, which is a kind of a life cycle kind of, when you think about it in a developmental story, it's a kind of a life cycle thing, right? You come into political awareness, you get kind of idealistic, and then you get disillusioned, and then you end up somewhere in the middle, or that's saying more conservative. But I do think that what we can bear in mind is that things change, individuals change, and when you are paying attention to politics, new information is going to come to you. I have friends who do a lot of the study of social media, and believe it or not, very few people are actually in a bubble. That's our sort of stereotype, but most people still do encounter news that's not purely partisan. It's very few people. Social media enhances their voices in a variety of ways, but anyway, there is a way of taking a long view. I don't have solutions to misinformation, but we have to bear in mind that the first step is getting people to be interested, and then they can become disillusioned and saved and pulled out of those spirals. But we need other mechanisms that can do that.
Terrific. Thanks so much. There's so much more. We're going to do Q&A. Let me just say there's so much more in the book that we didn't get to about deliberative fora, about political parties. So maybe we'll get to some of that in the Q&A.
Yes.
So I'm going to be calling on people. If I know you and I don't say your name, it's because my distance vision is very bad. So please don't take that personally. Okay, questions? Ding out.
All right. Do I need the mic or can I? All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. Congrats on the book. And thank you for this very clear presentation of it overall. I think it's a great title, and I wouldn't propose revising it to something else, but just to be provocative based on what you were describing, why not representative government for busy people. At the very beginning, you were talking about how your mother didn't have the resources to hire out a lot of help. And I was reminded of Constance's famous formulation that rich men hire stewards, and that was the benefit of representative government, that we can hire out when we're busy. And so I was wondering, I mean, I'm sure it's in the book, but if you could speak a little bit about representative structures, even elections. I mean, if we were truly democratic, we would pluck names out of a hat or be in an assembly. Even elections seem like something that's closer to a notion of representative government. So what do you make of that, this resource for hiring out when we don't have enough time?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Constant, actually. So one of the earliest versions of what became this book was a paper that basically began with his ancients and moderns. And basically, so those of you who are not familiar, Benjamin Constant was this French thinker who lived through the Revolution and the restoration of the monarchy. So he saw the rise of democracy and then it's like eradication, essentially. And he spoke shortly after the restoration and said, look, we've got a new form of political liberty. It's a form of liberty that requires us to find most of our enjoyment in life in the private sphere. So he's very much like a liberal in the philosophical sense, sort of. Anyway, but we still need some of the ancient desire to be like a part of a self-governing republic, a self-governing kind of government, and so we can't let private life dominate us too much. I'm a fan of representative government. I think that, as you put it, yeah, like I think that would be sort of fair. When I say democracy here, I do tend to assume it would be something like representative democracy, to be sure. My concern with something like sortition, the random selection of offices, which was very common in ancient Athens, the sort of the first democracy or the major ancient democracy. My concern with that is the problem of self-selection. Right. So the way that it worked in Athens and the way that these still work today is that you are not randomly selected for choice. It's not like serving on a criminal jury. On a criminal jury, they're not asking. They are. They're not asking. Yeah, they're not asking. You are required to show up. In Athens, you chose to put your name in a hat. What you are extended are invitations to participate in these random bodies. And the people who end up participating are different than the people who don't. Even when you try to have stratified sampling, you will get an odd group of people. Stratified meaning you try to get lower education people, you try to get lower income people. The people who show up are still tend to be more advantaged in a variety of ways. So I have deep concerns about its application today. The trick is still in that representative relationship, it seems to me. I think parties are a way that parties can play an important role in trying to get greater accountability, basically. But yeah, thank you.
Right here.
Thank you for your talk. I've got a lot of thoughts on this one. I was thinking about this sociologist who was talking about kind of like where power comes from. It's either organized people, organized capital, organized weapons, or maybe organized like theology. And organized capital is so strong and has managed to do all the things you're talking about, like gerrymandering, like buying politicians off. That said, I think there's just like this yawning gap between what people think and want to see changed and how none of it ever happens in Washington. Local and maybe state level, there's a little bit more hope and promise for it. And I'm involved in a few different local things in Albemarle County. And one of them is a board I'm on, and that paradox of empowerment, very much present, where it's the people with the resources to show up and say, I don't want this next to me, or I don't want, what are some concrete things, and parallel to that, sort of citizen social movements, things, just people getting together and that organized people part of it. What kind of concrete steps or practical advice for either, local government bodies and or local just movements would you recommend?
So thank you. Yes. So there's two different levels that I would think about this at. One is if we're thinking about how to reform how government works, that's one set of concerns. I'm not going to emphasize that because I think it's like beyond the scope of I think what you're mostly interested in. But just to say one word, which might be a little provocative about that, would be I think we have too many elections in the sense that like we vote for too many offices. The common thing we say about the US is we elect everyone from president to dog catcher. And I basically think, yeah, we should like not elect most of these offices, right? We should have them appointed, have them be more civil servant kind of staffed. But at that level, I'm going to say that, happy to talk more about that. But I think what do you do when you're like faced with an angry kind of crowd of self-selected people? I think one thing is to always bear in mind and to articulate, right, that like, I want to make sure that we're also making policy, we're making decisions that are responsive to the people that are not in the room. Not because for me, that is one of the most important things. There's this wonderful political theorist named Ann Phillips who wrote this wonderful book called The Politics of Presence. She's a feminist philosopher, and she emphasizes the way that the people who are physically in the room are essential. And in a way, this is like quite, in some ways, very obvious, but she articulates it beautifully because many people will say, anyone can be a representative of these people. Look at our fully white male legislature. They are representing like everyone. And it's like, yeah, okay. But like, you know, what famously the 1964 Civil Rights Act includes non-discrimination, discrimination against women is included in that bill. But it was added by a reactionary who was trying to use it as a poison pill to get the bill defeated. And it turned out there was one female member of Congress who like took it upon herself to shame her colleagues because they were like chuckling about it. Oh, women not being discriminated against, ha ha ha. And she, because she was physically present, she was in a play. Anyway, so look that up, it's cool. So making clear to the people that are there that they're not the only ones who matter. And to the extent that you can create decision procedures which elicit the views of people who are not in the room, whether that's through, I don't know if you have the capacity to do this, but having like, you know, deferring things to elections, putting local things on the ballot. I know that there are constitutional limits to that in a variety of states. Kentucky local governments can't do that, for instance, we turned out. We learned when we tried to do something. Yes, and then another idea, I would love to see a local government deploy this, is that replacing a public comment process with a jury process. Imagine drawing from the jury pool and inviting them to hear a proposal. And you could have those voices from the community come and speak for and against, and then you can have that jury provide their take, essentially. And that would be a way to kind of launder the conversation through a disinterested group, but the decision makers would still be elected and authorized by the people. Those are some ideas that I've been thinking about lately. I don't know if those are entirely responsive, but.
Right here.
This may sound too generic, but I just get overwhelmed with all the information coming at me and all the different ways it gets there. Do you have any thoughts about how to distill best sources so that a busy person can make sense of this without, you know, retreating to a bubble where you only hear what it is that you want to know?
I've been thinking about this a little bit lately, and when it comes to the information environment, it's very difficult. I recognize that. And so there's like specific, you know, kinds of advice, like, you know, finding issue-specific fora, right? So there's a website called Reddit that has a lot of like issue-specific, like communities that are like devoted to particular types of issues. They usually include all sorts of other kind of irreverent discussions, but it's a place that people who, for instance, have like exotic diseases, like, you know, rare diseases, can kind of locate each other and find support. But I think more practically, one of the ways of helping to kind of tune out might be too strong, but like reduce the cacophony, is to reflect. What do I care about? What ultimately matters to me? Right? If a party changed its position, or if a candidate changed their position on this issue but kept everything else the same, what would move my vote, right? So something like, this person says that they want to like privatize Social Security. I don't care if everything else, right, is in line with me. This is a no-go for me. And then focusing on that issue in the information environment. So stories on that, welfare provision, digital security, or digital privacy, right? Whatever kind of issue that becomes that is that acid test, the thing that fills you with concern, motivation, fires you up, and then searching for that issue with the names of candidates, with the names of parties. That could be a way to try to like focus your inquiry in the news environment. It's a hard row to hoe.
Right over here.
Thank you so much. This is really, I'm interested in looking at the book. I'm interested in democracy for unbusy people. You touched on it a minute ago when you talked about who's in the room and who is not. Could you address, or did you maybe in your book address voting by people who are incarcerated?
Sorry, if you can just maybe say one word, that whether they should or not be, or like, sorry, so as in, should they vote?
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes. So as far as I'm concerned, they have interests that democracy could harm, does harm. You might think that they have a very informed perspective on the functioning of certain basic institutions in our government. It seems to me that their input would be relevant to making policy in these areas. So I do not tackle that directly, but the logic of inclusion, I argue that within the kind of vast array of democratic values, that inclusion really comes first. It's not the same thing as saying that it trumps everything else, but it should come first. So unless we have extraordinarily strong reasons to want to exclude some person or group, for instance, a group who's like, we don't want to do elections anymore, maybe they shouldn't be allowed to participate in elections. But if someone's like, well, they did a crime, okay, do they pay taxes? Like, yeah, okay, then then they have other interests that are also at issue here. Yeah, so yes, the wider logic would recommend that they do. Yeah.
I think Bennett.
I'm sorry to make you walk all the way over. I can come up and no? Okay. Howdy. So one of the things that I really loved about your book is it did sort of go against the grain within democratic theory. It's so focused now on like mini publics, deliberative fora, sortition, et cetera. But one of the questions I had is whether elections fall victim to the paradox of empowerment, not necessarily within like voting, but within like running. Because obviously there are very few people who have the capacity to run and win. Because people spend millions of dollars, right, on elections and not often have the capacity to win. Does that limit necessarily because it is very participatory, but does that limit the justice enhancing function of politics? Because one of the things that you say very clearly in the book is one of the reasons that apathy is so bad is that it cannot solve just like problems of justice. Whereas if I were to participate within a mini public, I might have more capacity to change things. Obviously there's some problems with that too. Yeah, just what do you think on that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say, depends on how you characterize this. I am a skeptic on deliberative mini publics, which are like randomly selected groups of people who will get together to talk about an issue and then potentially could make a decision, a binding decision potentially. Usually they're advisory, but sometimes they could be decisive. I think that their place should be secondary to elections because of the inclusive potential of them. Now, that leaves a considerable role for them. And I think that one of the ways that you can deploy them most effectively is in issues that the existing political parties don't know how to process. This is what happened in Ireland, for instance. Ireland had two, they've had a few, but like they had two very important citizens' assemblies that one of them made abortion legal, which was illegal in the constitution. So they had to change their constitution to make abortion legal. And then they also legalized marriage equality through this. Basically, the group deliberated on the issue and then wrote a referendum which went to the public. That's a pretty good system, it seems to me, because it's responsive to mass electorates. The first one of these bodies had a bunch of members of the parliament were in it, actually. It went so well that they're like, we trust citizens to do this on their own. So they weren't in the next one. So I do think there's a role for them, but I think it really needs to be paired with elections. A lot of the strongest advocates think it should take the place of elections. I think that's a mistake for some of the reasons of like basically having somebody there who's like doing the job for you is I think going to be a much more, it's going to make it more tractable. It's going to make it more inclusive. When it comes to who can run, that is a very serious issue. In the US, the cost of running for office is a function of a few different features of our system, which are campaign finance. We have basically a Supreme Court that has invented this idea that money is the same thing as speech. It's not written anywhere. Nobody passed a law to this effect, right? It's just a thing that the courts decided, which also suggests that it's something that could be changed. But other elements are that our parties are pretty weak and they're not very competitive, right, in most places where they are. So there are ways that stronger parties can have incentives to end up looking more like their voters. And this is part of the reason that we see the Democratic Party looks much more like the United States, because they are attempting to appeal to the parts of the country that look more like the United States. And the Republican Party looks more like its voting bloc, its main supporting bloc. It's whiter, it's more male, right? And so partly that's a function of the uncompetitiveness of our politics to some extent. Then there are other things you can do which can enhance who the parties are trying to recruit. Some countries have quotas, which require a minimum number of candidates to be generally women is the most common one. There'll be a quota for 40% of people on your ballot sort of have to be women. These are ways that people have looked to try to create more try to get representatives who look more like the country. But yeah, it's tough in the US because of how we do our elections. The other thing is that we elect people from single member districts, which make it very, very difficult to get people who don't look like the largest single block. Very important. That's a big reason that a lot of representatives are male and white, is because in a lot of places, not all districts, but lots of districts, that's the most common voter. It's
All right, I think one longer or two shorter questions. So right back here.
I should be quicker with my responses. These questions are it's so good. These issues are so, yeah.
Hey, I wanted to say I really appreciated you mentioning the Capitol crawl, just as a young politically engaged disabled person myself. And so my question kind of touches on, and you addressed it a little bit with inaccessibility of language, and you've used the word accessibility a lot. I guess a lot of disabled folks are more likely because of experience to be politically or want to be politically engaged, but are then unable to access these spaces of political engagement. And so I was wondering if with your ideas about mandatory voting, when we've just seen mail-in voting gutted in a lot of ways, how would you attend to people who have the time and the positionality to be politically engaged, but then are physically unable to access those spaces of engagement?
Yeah. It's a great question, and there's people who know a lot more about this than I do. This is one of the, I think, one of the most important kind of areas of inquiry in democratic theory. There's not enough people working on it, I think. But one of the big differences that the pandemic has made is that it has opened digital spaces, I think, in a way that can be very potentially empowering. Insofar as we do have public debate, not public, public comment processes, right? Those are spaces in which it is much more accessible in these technical ways. Now, this raises all these, like, insofar as we then make these empowered spaces, then it raises the similar kinds of problems. So yeah, now, like, again, it's a hard issue. So one area where so there's one political theorist who has a book coming out. He advocates deliberative mini publics that are issue based. So, I mean, sorry, it's not just literally like taking a legislature and making it randomly selected and then breaking it up by subject, basically. So exactly like our Congress, all of our legislatures have committees on them, and those committees have a specialized jurisdiction, but he wants all of those to be randomly selected. So if you had, and one of the issues with that would be, for disabled people might not get selected randomly, and that might be a problem, right? There's lots of reasons to think that they wouldn't be selected, but you can maybe put a quota on if you had one of these kind of bodies that's randomly selected to deal with issues so basically, I think if you were to delegate an issue like this to a deliberative mini public, if you have a legislature that's like, we don't really care about this issue, but there are people who do, and we understand that there should be some action, you could have a process that's either citizen-led to initiate, so a kind of citizen initiative to create a deliberative mini public, which would then issue forth either a referendum or recommendations to the legislature. That might be a way to get these issues on the agenda, but still have them, because the key thing is that you still want them to be accountable or accountable to mass publics in one way or another. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to have to leave it there. Sorry. Please join me in thanking Kevin for a great.